Hi, and welcome back to one of our online lectures here in world history. Today we're going to kick off the Middle Ages. Really what today's lecture is going to be all about is setting up the Middle Ages. We're going to look at the causes, kind of why the Middle Ages occurred, and we're also going to kind of do an overview of the effects of the Middle Ages. And that's something we'll kind of touch on as we go through the unit. But we're going to just provide some of the changes that occurred in Europe as an overview of what this Middle Ages period really is going to be all about. So, one of the things I want you to do, on your note sheet you see a discussion question. And in class we'll do a think, pair, share, but I want you to think about this question just for a moment and jot down some ideas you might have. The question says, if our American government disappeared today, how would our lives be different tomorrow? How would our lives be different next month? How would our lives be different next year? Obviously without government there would be some major changes. So I want you to just pause and think about this question, jot some things that come to mind. When you're done, you can go ahead and restart this video. Moving on, we have one constructive response question we're going to look to answer in today's lecture. And the question's pretty straightforward. It says, describe the cause or causes of the Middle Ages, as well as several of the changes that occurred in Europe as a result. So naturally, that's where we're going to go with this. We're going to take a look at why this Middle Ages period occurred, and we'll look at some of those overview ideas that we see some major changes occur in Europe. What will we learn? What's our path to learning? We'll talk about what is the Middle Ages. We need to define that first. Told you we're going to talk about the causes of the Middle Ages, and then we'll look at the changes that occurred during the Middle Ages. So that's ultimately our path to learning here today. So let's start with that first question. What is the Middle Ages? A lot of people see the Middle Ages as the time of the knights and time of medieval Europe. You sometimes hear that word medieval, and there's a lot of truth to that. Sometimes you see castles and you see jousting and things like that. That did exist during the Middle Ages. Knights were an integral part of the Middle Ages, but we're going to build up to that as we progress throughout this unit. We want to get back to the core of really what the Middle Ages period was and why it began. So the Middle Ages, what is it? Well, it's a time period that existed between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, and that's a big chunk of time. Historians seem to agree that Rome fell completely. The last Roman emperor ruled Rome in 476 AD. After that, Rome was no more. So 476 AD up until the Renaissance. And the Renaissance really starts around 1300 in Italy, but really expands to the rest of Europe by around 1500. So if we do the math there, this lasts for roughly 1,000 years. That's a long period of time, so roughly 500 to 1500 AD. That is the time of the Middle Ages. It has other names. Sometimes you'll hear the Middle Ages referred to as the Dark Ages or simply the medieval period. And again, medieval, we tend to think of knights and jousting and that kind of stuff. And part of that's a little bit Renaissance in nature, but it does definitely fit into the Middle Ages period. Now, because of the lack of government, because of the fall of Rome, the Middle Ages is often seen as a very bleak and dangerous period. And there's a lot of truth to that. The average citizen, for the extent of the 1,000-year period here, would have gotten up every day and simply tried to survive. Society really doesn't advance itself. People aren't creating great works of art. They aren't innovating a lot of things. For the most part, people are just surviving. And so that's why we often see the Middle Ages a very bleak and dangerous period. There is a lot of fighting that goes on during the Middle Ages. Now, all of this has to start with the fall of Rome. Fall of Rome is the catalyst for all of this to occur. So if we look at the causes of the Middle Ages, it's really singular. The fall of Rome was caused by invading Germanic tribes. Now, Rome was weakened for a lot of different reasons. If you recall our Roman unit, when we looked at the social, political, military, and economic factors that weakened Rome, but those things allowed for these Germanic tribes to move in and take over. And when that happened, as mentioned, the last Roman emperor fled. Rome's no longer ruled by Romans, and the stability that the Roman Empire had completely disappears. And that's going to lead to some major changes, some major effects for the people who lived in this region. Now, so as we look at these different Germanic invasions, these are the changes that occurred. So when we look at the Middle Ages as a whole, it's a very different time period. Part of that is because as these different invasions moved in, you can see here, and you don't need to know these names, but it's the Goths, the Vandals, the Visigoths, the Lombards, the Saxons, the Franks. All these different groups were moved and pushed into Roman lands. So you can see that here on the map, all these different areas that they went to. And the Romans just couldn't maintain control anymore. So because of that, you have disruption of trade. You can't have a trade system anymore. Merchant trade collapsed, and Europe's economic centers were destroyed. It means people didn't go to the cities anymore to conduct their business. It wasn't safe anymore. And money also became scarce. So this leads to the downfall of cities. If it's not safe to trade in cities, cities aren't going to exist anymore. So cities were abandoned as centers of administration. And most of these Germanic tribes that moved in, they couldn't read, they couldn't write, they didn't have established laws, so they wouldn't have had a need for cities. And so the people fled Roman cities, they fled those areas to try to go to safer, more rural areas. So of course Europe then becomes more rural. Roman cities were left without strong leadership. You didn't have military strength anymore. You didn't have economic strength anymore. So those cities just were not the place to be. People went out to the countryside, set up small villages where they felt safe. Of course, with all of this, just because you have this Germanic group moving in and causing all this problem, and the fact that they couldn't read or write, you get a major decline of learning. Germanic invaders could not read or write. Learning became less important as people moved to rural areas. If I get up every single day and I know that if I don't eat today, I might die, then my whole purpose in life is trying to find my next meal. I'm not going to worry whether I can read or write. That's going to become secondary to survival. So that was the case for a lot of people. Naturally, you're not going to open up a book if you need to, go out and hunt and try to find your meal for the day or the family. So learning becomes almost scarce. And that really sets humanity back. I mean, imagine where we would be if for these 1,000 years we had advanced learning rather than stopped learning and reading and writing. So it is amazing to think where humanity would be today if the Middle Ages period never happened. You also lose that common language that Rome had. Latin was the main language of the Romans, but as these Germanic people moved in and took over, their languages intermixed with Latin. So Latin changed as Germanic people mixed with the Roman population. You're going to lose that established government that the Romans have. So this leads to a loss of established government. Germanic tribes did not have written laws because they couldn't read and write. They didn't have an orderly government to write down their laws or discuss new laws. They were a pretty wild group of people. And they were pretty uncivilized if you want to compare them to the Romans. So this once great Roman Empire that had big cities where people learned with the common language of Latin, with established order and government, all disappear because these Germanic people didn't live that way and the Romans didn't have enough strength anymore. So the last question we want to answer here is, how did the Middle Ages change Europe? What were the effects of the Middle Ages? So naturally, one of the big changes, you're going to have new rises of Germanic kingdoms. The Germanic people take hold, and they're going to start having the power. One of the groups we're going to talk about a lot in the next lecture is the Franks, specifically a ruler named Charlemagne. So we get the new Germanic kingdoms that emerge, and one of them specifically will be called the Holy Roman Empire, which you see here. The other thing that we get is the rise of the feudal system in Europe. This is not too different from the feudal system we talked about in Japan. But you can see here, feudalism is a hierarchy of different relationships with different people. You have peasants, you have knights, you have nobles, you have kings. And in one of our next lessons, we're going to see how all that works together in something called feudalism. Couple of the other causes of the Middle Ages, effects of the Middle Ages, is we're going to see the power of the Christian church growing rapidly. I should make a note that that is the Catholic Church, but people would have just called it the Christian church at the time. So Christianity is going to grow in strength a lot during the Middle Ages. So along with that, of course, the leader of the Catholic Church is the Pope, so the power of the Pope and other popes grows rapidly as well. We already mentioned this one. Europe became more rural, kind of like what you see here. That was done to try to make them safer. And it's a lot of times it worked and sometimes it didn't, but it's definitely a major effect of the Middle Ages. We already mentioned that learning takes a back seat, so there's no major emphasis on learning. Doesn't mean people won't learn, because we are going to talk about monasteries and convents, but learning is definitely not as widespread as it had been under the Romans. Continuing on with our effects, new languages are going to replace Latin. We mentioned that as the Germanic people move in and take over, their languages will mix with Latin and we'll get just changes, eventually leading us to French, British, Spanish, Portuguese, and all the other languages that exist in Europe today. One of the last themes we're going to look at in this unit, though, is early signs of modern European countries begin to appear. It's going to take nearly that 1,000-year period, but we're going to start to see Europe form as we see Europe today with the rise of England and France. Okay, let's revisit our constructive response question so that we can wrap up this lecture on the causes and effects of the Middle Ages. Remember, our question says, describe the cause or causes of the Middle Ages, as well as several of the changes that occurred in Europe as a result. Well, we know the main cause of the Middle Ages is the fall of Rome. But there's kind of multiple factors involved in that. We could break down the fall of Rome into the social, political, economic, and military factors. Those we looked at in our unit on Rome about a month ago. But really, the major cause of the fall of Rome was those Germanic invasions, which really took over Roman lands. So ultimately, we have to talk about the fall of Rome and those Germanic invasions as the beginning of this question. But the changes that occurred in Europe as a result, we know there was a disruption of trade, downfall of cities, Europe became more rural, we had a loss of common language, government changed due to the tribes, the Germanic tribes and their ways of life. Certainly you're going to have a lack of education. So we've gone through several different changes that really we're going to see here in the Middle Ages. And what we want to do as we move forward here in this unit is talk about some of the specific things that happened. For example, we'll talk about the rise of the Franks. We'll talk about the rise of the Catholic Church. We'll look at the Crusades. We'll look at the bubonic plague. All of those are events that occur in the Middle Ages. So that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of this unit. So that's going to do it for us here today. I hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.